Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Centerpoint. I'm Doug McKelway. Central to our democracy is the right to vote. It is the opportunity to shape your future, or so we hope. But there's an outstanding question for Republicans, for independents, and for Democrats. Are we now able to trust the outcome of these votes? In the Constitution of the United States, citizens are given the blessings of liberty, freedoms given to form a more perfect union and establish justice. These rights mirror those given to us by God. Free will to have a true and honest relationship with Him, not by coercion, but by choice. Just as free will is critical to a relationship with God, free elections are critical to the health and prosperity of our country, critical to that mandate of forming a more perfect union and establishing justice, and especially critical to our ability to freely proclaim the Word of God and the truths as written in the Bible. Here's what history has shown us. There are many ways to get away with fraudulent voting and almost as many ways to detect it. Variations of fraud have been going on for decades, and so have the complaints, the new laws and solutions that were supposed to stop it. No less than the Supreme Court has concurred with this statement from the National Commission on Federal Election Reform, noting that the known instances of fraud, quote, demonstrate that not only is the risk of voter fraud real, but that it could affect the outcome of a close election. As Christians, we are called to a higher standard, a standard of truth, honesty, and fairness. A fairness that in this divided political year desperately requires reliability in elections. Joining me now is the senior pastor of the Christian Cultural Center, A.R. Bernard. Pastor Bernard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you, Doug, always.
Let's talk about how Christianity affects our voting. We have to be honest in the voting booth.
Well, I think you articulated it very well in your opening statement. And as you were speaking, I was reflecting on the words forming a more perfect union. And that language speaks of time and process. And historically, we have had seasons in our nation where the voting process has been disrupted, attacked, challenged, questioned. And then we've had times as recent as 2006 when then Republican President George Bush signed the Voting Rights Act reauthorization. It passed overwhelmingly in the House and unanimously in the Senate. So we had agreement in our nation when it comes to the importance of voting, the integrity of voting, and making sure that everyone has access, which is what the 1965 Voting Rights Act presented. Access, especially amongst Latinos, African Americans, Asians, Native Americans. But now we've gone from bipartisan agreement to partisan politics, influencing and attacking and pointing the finger at each other. The voting process is sacred, as far as I'm concerned. And any interference with it, by any side, by anyone, it should be held to a higher standard and severe penalties as a result of any interference. It should be free of partisan and influence and political influence, and should be free from illegitimate voting as well. So I'm looking at both sides of this.
So we're in this constant struggle in the effort to form a more perfect union of striking the right balance. And there are people on one side of the aisle now who are saying that the pendulum has swung too far in the sense that we're not imposing any requirements in some states and some jurisdictions to make sure that you are eligible to vote, that you are a citizen of the United States, that you've got your one ballot and you're casting that one ballot. We don't want you to vote for the dog or to have a dog vote for somebody that you favor, I should say. And we don't want you to vote twice, and we don't want you to impose your will on somebody else. We want them to impose their own will and God's will on what they feel in the voting.
Unfortunately, we've been reactive instead of proactive. The pendulum swings from right to left, from between the two extremes. And I think that we need to think out in the future, out ahead of ourselves. So instead of just reacting when we discover problems within our voting system and then we go to the other extreme, no, let's look out into the future and find a perfect balance, as perfect as we can, balance of allowing that freedom of the individual to vote, because your voice is your vote is your voice. Allowing that freedom, but at the same time protecting that freedom from interference from personal agendas, from special interests, from political parties. I think that should be a wake-up call for us to not go to the other extreme, but find the balance.
Some would say that we cannot achieve what you're just saying we need to achieve without Christianity. We were founded on Christian principles, and some say, it depends on what polls you look at and what experts you talk with, but some people are saying that Christianity is declining, and with it, in this country, the truth. With it, honesty.
Well, I don't buy into that decline of Christianity. You know, this is the one institution, the church, that Jesus said the gates of hell shall not prevail against. So we've been through our ups and downs. We've been through our challenges. And the church and Christianity has lived through the last 2,000 years of regime changes, political influences, all of that. But here we are. And we are an essential part of the fiber of American culture. We are ceremonially and culturally, in all of our institutions, our belief systems, our practices, our customs, our attitudes, we are Christian. And as Christians, we understand the importance of having that individual voice, yet collective responsibility.
How do you avoid, as a pastor, politicizing your sermons or your message?
You know, politics is power. There's a little bit of politics in everything, right? Everything that we do.
For sure.
I think that we need to present the pros and cons. We need to begin with God's order, God's perspective on the nature and ordering of society, and we should uphold that. We must be careful when we allow politics to inform our faith. Our faith should be informing our politics. So it's about striking the right balance. And we live in a tension. That's real.
And striking that right balance means the pendulum swings.
Yeah.
Continues swinging.
Yeah.
Pastor A.R. Bernard, thank you. There is no question that this country desperately needs to have as fair and honest an election as possible. In a moment, I'm going to be joined by a roundtable of political specialists to discuss how we get there. Pastor Bernard, please join us again for that conversation as soon as we hear their opening comments. Now, a brief taste of some of what's created a lot of news on this very subject in the past.
The Georgia State Elections Board has issued multiple subpoenas to learn whether new accusations of ballot harvesting during the 2020 elections are true.
And today they arrested 20 Floridians for voting illegally in the 2020 election.
The state of Florida has charged and is in the process of arresting 20 individuals across the state for voter fraud.
Mail-in ballot fraud in Gregg County relating to the 2018 primary election.
3 Rhode Island men are facing charges of voter fraud. They're accused of submitting ballots in 2 different states during the 2020 election.
It comes as state lawmakers move forward now with a bill that would make it easier to vote early or through mail-in ballots.
Now, opponents of the bill say it would open the door for voter fraud and abuses of the mail ballot system.
The U.S. Attorney issued a statement saying 9 mail-in ballots from military members were found discarded.
So just a taste of what we're talking about here. As you can see, or about to see, we have a really strong panel here in Dallas. Thank you all for coming in, by the way. Marc is the Chief Communications Officer at America First Policy Institute. Dinesh D'Souza, the author and filmmaker responsible for the film 2,000 Mules. Phil Klein, the former Attorney General for the state of Kansas. And Eric Eggers, Vice President of the Government Accountability Institute. Again, thank you all. Eric, I want to start with you. There is an expression in these bad economic times that when the U.S. sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. There's sort of a corollary to that, an inverse of that. You've heard the term, the shining city on the hill. That actually comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Fast forward several decades, several centuries, I should say, and it's been used in American politics. Ronald Reagan described the United States as a shining city on the hill. In other words, it is a beacon of hope. Why? Because our Constitution is derived from God. The concept of freedom is derived from God. So viewers of this network, who span the world quite literally, are very, very curious about what's going on in the United States. We set an example. And the example that we have set these days when it comes to election integrity is not really strong. Turning to your book now, which was written in 2018, predating the 2020 election fracas. Let me quote from it. It is jarring to learn that the Election Integrity Project, a joint international venture of Harvard University and the University of Sydney, ranked the integrity of American elections on a par with those of Argentina, Mongolia, and Rwanda. It gives added meaning to a dictum commonly attributed to Joseph Stalin, quote, I consider it completely unimportant who will in the party will vote or how. But what is extraordinarily important is this, who will count the votes and how. America needs to do better, end quote. Well, America has done no better than you wrote about in 2018. In fact, there's plenty of evidence it's done a lot worse.
No, that's absolutely true. And it's such an important topic because, as you noted, the United States is a Christian nation. And so being a Christian nation means we should stand for truth and we should stand for integrity. And our witness to the rest of the world is only as good as the people that lead this country. And if there are questions about the nature of truth and integrity in which we've elected the leaders of this country, then I think what good is our witness to the rest of the world? The fact is that we, when it comes to our election technology and the manner in which we conduct elections, are essentially a third world country. Other countries, right, if we're going to continue the Christian metaphor, would send their teenagers to the United States on spring break mission trips to try to spread the gospel of secure and safe elections because we don't get it right. We have so many things wrong, and that's why you see questions that are raised, as we did with the 2020 election. And it starts with our voter rolls, right? As soon as you are registered to vote, then it is impossible to detect a vote that's done by a legal voter versus a vote that was done by an illegal voter. And the Supreme Court in 2012 cited statistics that said nearly 1 in 8 voter registrations in this country are wrong. So we're talking about tens of millions of voter registrations that we know have problems. So if you're trying to clean up American elections, then it has to start with the voter rolls. But unfortunately, as your piece just showed, the problems go much deeper than that.
You know, I think it was George Washington, going back, you may have referenced this in your book. Election fraud is not new. It's gone back since before the time the United States existed. And in fact, George Washington ran for the House of Burgesses, I think it was, and did not do too well until he discovered in the next election that if he provided whiskey.
We used to conduct elections in taverns. That's absolutely correct. So election integrity problems are literally baked in to the founding of our nation.
Yeah. So has it gotten worse, gentlemen?
Absolutely. I mean, it wasn't whiskey this time. It was hundreds of millions of dollars that were poured into election offices to convert them into campaign offices for candidates. And there are 3 critical principles here. One is that the umpire in the election must be objective and not have private interests dictate what happened. Secondly, the American people of both parties need to watch the counting and be able to watch the counting to prevent it from going wrong. That is vitally important as you look at this. And thirdly, every ballot and every citizen must be treated the same. That didn't happen in 2020. There are things we can do to fix it, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, in the initial part of your statement right there, I think you were referring to Zuck bucks.
It's a tip of the iceberg.
That's the tip of the iceberg. We're going to get into a Zuck bucks or Zucker bucks, as some people say, Mark Zuckerberg. But that's for another segment. Dinesh, your observations about it, why it's worse now.
I'm an immigrant to the United States. I've been in the country now 40 years. I mean, for most of that time, I got to say I had a civics book idea of America. I would march in, draw the curtain, cast my ballot. I never dreamed that I'd do anything more than that. I always assumed I'd then turn on the TV. Somebody's going to add up the ballots correctly. Someone's going to tell me who won. I never doubted the process. Now, 2020 was a little different because in 2020, the rules changed. Suddenly, you have all these mail-in drop boxes popping up, and not popping up evenly everywhere in the country, but popping up in certain places more than others. Suddenly, you have all kinds of people not showing up to vote in person, voting basically. Now, when you vote in person, there's a limited opportunity to cheat. There are people there, you get a ballot, you get one ballot, you got to put it in yourself. If you're voting in person and I were to say to the guys over there, let me go home for 30 minutes, I got to run an errand, I'll bring back my ballot and drop it in, they'd be like, no, you got to do it now. So there's all kinds of checks when you do it in person. An absentee ballot goes out there and then reappears in a box. a mailbox. The ballot is taken out of the envelope. The name and address are on the ballot, on the envelope, not on the ballot. Once those two pieces of paper are separated, essentially they can't be put back together again. And so let's just say there's massive election fraud, and we know it for a fact. There's no way for us to go back, ferret out the bad ballots, separate. It's not like counterfeit money where you can go check the bill, go, these are counterfeit bills. So we have a process in 2020 that was suspect from the beginning. And the premise of the film that I did, 2,000 Mules, was not merely that there was a possibility of fraud, but there's a lot of evidence of it.
This is an example of multiple ballots. So this
3:57 a.m.
Prime voting time.
Got to beat the lines.
This person comes up, and what you're going to see is when you try to put too many ballots in.
He needs a shoehorn.
And we have lots of those, where they're just jamming them in and then they fall on the ground. And when you can jam them...
I mean, this alone is, to say the least, suggestive. Who's voting at 3:57 a.m. with a whole bunch of ballots?
And then being able to match that ping where he's standing there to the next place he goes.
Marc Louder, I want to get your perspective on the broader problem first.
Yeah, it's not new, unfortunately. I mean, there was a commission, I think it was early, mid-'80s, led by former President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, former Secretary of State James Baker, who identified mail-in ballots as being the most likely and suspect and absentee ballots for potential fraud. And yet, as we've continued on now decades later, we have, you know, mail-in ballot, absentee ballot fraud. And then let's also go back just in history, recent history. I mean, there has not been an election that has, since 2000, that has not been contested, with the exception of Barack Obama's 2 elections. I mean, you had massive questions, including non-certification votes in the House in 2000. They also voted against George W. Bush's win in 2004. Obviously, they thought Russia colluded in 2016. You have the issues in 2020. Why hasn't it been fixed? Why have we not done any of the basic steps to secure the election?
You mentioned the Carter Commission report, which was commissioned in 2005, or at least completed in 2005, which was commissioned as a result of the Florida vote in 2000, Bush v. Gore, which was the subject of tremendous national frustration and anger, and which has continued to this very day. But let me quote from the Carter Commission report here. It says, quote, "Absentee ballots remain the largest source of potential voter fraud. Absentee balloting is vulnerable to abuse in several ways. Blank ballots mailed to the wrong address or to large residential buildings might get intercepted. Citizens who vote at home, at nursing homes, at the workplace, or in church are more susceptible to pressure, overt and subtle, or to intimidation. Vote buying schemes are far from difficult to detect when citizens vote by mail." The U.S. Census in the year 2020 said that 43% of voters in the United States cast their ballots by mail. Compare that to 2016. 21% mailed in their ballots. So it virtually doubled in the election cycle of 2020. Have any of those election rules which allowed this 43% of votes to be cast in 2020 been changed since 2020?
Well, Doug, just think about what you just said, though. What happened in 2020, to Marc's point, I think to everyone's point, is that more votes were cast in 2020 by the least secure method possible in American history. Right. And that's not a fact that's disputed. It's not a partisan point. It is just the truth. So more people cast ballots in a way in which it's impossible to detect the verification of the identity and the validity of the vote. So, yeah, and unfortunately, I think what's happened is because people realize how politically advantageous it is, not just from that nature, but from the partisan get-out-the-vote effort as well. Because to Dinesh's point, Dinesh used to go into a ballot and pull the curtain. It was just you and your ballot. We cast votes. We fought for the right to cast votes in a politically sterile environment. That is not what happened in 2020.
In fact, that's why the voting booth was created.
That's exactly
so people
correct.
would not be intimidated or pressured.
Yeah, but what happened in 2020 is people were intimidated, pressured. I live in Florida. We sort of invented the political pressure game. We actually target nursing homes in a practice that's known as granny farming, because people will go and they'll target elderly elderly populations, and Florida actually passed a law to make it illegal. The problem got so bad. But that's exactly what happened in 2020, and I think the good news is some states are beginning to change the laws to try to counter-correct it, but it's not enough, and it's happening too late.
And I'll to your point, I mean, we've had actually 2 very high-profile cases where the Delaware, not a traditional red state, not a red state at all, but the Delaware Supreme Court overturned a law passed by the Delaware legislature which expanded mail-in balloting similar to what happened in 2020. They said, no, it's unconstitutional. And then the Wisconsin Supreme Court also overturned the ballot box initiative, which their legislature, or the drop boxes, that what they tried to use. So we do see now in a non-COVID pandemic where a lot of these things were allowed to happen for the greater public health, they're now walking them back and going, don't do it again.
There's another point in that, and that is in 2020, they broke the law. The laws were clear. For example, absentee ballots, as you indicated, are cast away from a trained election worker, which you can't verify the identity of the person casting the ballot, and they can be intimidated or misled. So, for example, in Wisconsin, they have a law with nursing homes that it requires members of both parties to go to the nursing home to make sure that the voter is not misled and that the voter votes. They broke the law. And in nursing homes, our investigation revealed they had 100% turnout in most of these, and many of these nursing homes, the people who voted are not competent to vote. They're suffering from illness, which prevents them from even knowing what they're doing. So part of the problem, we have laws. The laws weren't followed. Those laws don't have any sanctions. They don't have any standing for people to bring litigation, and they don't have any repercussions for breaking the law. And that's a problem.
In my view, the single biggest problem that we've had post-election is the inability to even have, well, the kind of conversation we're having here. Yes. A thick wall of censorship has descended on this topic, and it's censorship not in defense of the truth, but it's censorship in defense of propositions that are on the face of it absurd. So you just read from the Carter Commission that absentee ballots are the most vulnerable. You then pointed out that while those ballots were a small fraction of the overall number of ballots, in 2020 they were not. They were a big part of the overall vote. So right away you think, man, you got to be extra vigilant in 2020 because we've changed the rules in a way that makes it more vulnerable to cheating. Immediately following the election, a public proclamation goes out, echoed by the cyber technology group, echoed by every major politician, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi. This is the most secure election in U.S. history. Now, it's one thing to say, you know, you don't have the proof of fraud, you can't show me enough fraud to overturn the election, but to positively affirm this is the most secure election in history, the question in my mind is, where's the comparison between the volume of fraud in 2020 versus 2016, 2012, 2008, all the way back? Show me that there is less fraud in 2020 than there has been in every previous election. And not only has that never been done, to my knowledge, it's never been attempted. So you take a proposition that is dogmatic and preposterous on its face, and then you surround it with the idea that anybody who questions this is perpetrating a big lie. Anybody who questions this needs to be thrown off social media.
And investigated.
And investigated. And so a pall of ignorance and fear settles on the whole country, which has not, to my knowledge, to this moment, fully dissipated.
Well, and think about what the messaging did on the front end as well, because you're exactly right, right? We were told as soon as we decided the election, hey, it's done, it's over, there's no room. In fact, not just that there's no room for dissent, any dissent will be censored, it'll be labeled, you'll have some potential ramifications as well. But on the front end, leading up to the election, we were told, hey, the election is going to be conducted under unusual circumstances. It may take a while for us to figure out who won. That means the system's working exactly correctly.
That continues. When we come back, what they call Zuckbucks, as in Meta, Facebook chief Mark Zuckerberg and his several $100 million donations, or perhaps should we call it investment in the last election.
To request your free copy of Extreme Devotion, call 844-803-2881. Following Christ has always come with a price, and many have paid the ultimate price. The Voice of the Martyrs, co-authors of the bestseller Jesus Freaks, brings you a daily devotional with 365 inspiring stories of courage, commitment, confession, and compassion. In an age of extremes, you will find faith, strength, and encouragement and hope in the stories of fellow believers from all over the world and from ancient times up to the present. These men and women, both young and old, went to the outer limits of human devotion. Each story is true. Each story is unforgettable. Each story is extreme. Each story could change your life. Request your free copy of Extreme Devotion by calling 844-803-2881. That's 844-803-2881.
Welcome back to our Centerpoint special on the integrity of our elections. Joining us now, our distinguished panel of guests, is the senior pastor of New York's largest evangelical church, the Christian Cultural Center in New York, Pastor A.R. Bernard. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
You're an absolutely vital voice in this discussion, and I'm so glad you're here. Election integrity, election security, and you know this as a pastor of what is, I'm assuming, a largely African-American church, means something entirely different in this country to a lot of Americans. And I'm embarrassed about our country to admit that it was not until January 23rd, 1964, that the 24th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. It prohibits both Congress and the states from conditioning the right to vote in federal elections on payments of a poll tax or other type of tax. That's a deep, deep scarring memory for a lot of poor people in the South, a lot of African Americans in the South who were forced, up until 1964 technically, to pay poll taxes to vote. The people who could least afford it.
You know, you raise an important question. My perspective as a person of color and the checkered past when it comes to our right to vote and participate fully in the social and political life of American society, voter integrity is an important issue for us. And if I didn't believe there was a possibility and a potential for voter and election fraud, I would be less concerned about voter integrity. But I'm concerned because of the possibility. Has it existed? Absolutely. To the degree that it can overturn an election result, that's debatable and has to be investigated. But I'm glad that we are at a place in our society where we're taking it very seriously. Why is the right to vote important to me? I'll give you 3 reasons. Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, 1964. I could have no better reasons than 2 white guys and a black guy gave their life for my right to vote. So the integrity of it, absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm. Has it gone too far?
I would say if Donald Trump won the election and we're having these conversations, absolutely. If we're only having these conversations because he lost the election, then that's a problem. Mm-hmm. I think that regardless of who wins, we have a responsibility to assure our public that there is integrity and legitimacy to the outcome of our elections and the use of their vote. We have enough voter apathy in our nation. We don't need to add to it. And I have a problem with extreme rhetoric that creates mass hysteria as to whether an individual's vote counts.
A mass hysteria of the sort which occurred on January 6th, among other things.
Well, that's one. I'm not going to drop everything January 6th. I understand some of the passions that were at work that day. I disagree with the tactics, but I understand the passion.
That brings me now to Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know if he's a bad man or a good man, if his intentions were good, But there was a factor in the 2020 election called Zuckbucks. Some people say Zuckerbucks, as in Meta, Facebook chief Marc Zuckerberg, and his several million-dollar donation, or perhaps we should call it an investment, in the last election, announced with fanfare and later perceived to be a direct strike on the integrity of our elections. Take a look at this.
Facebook CEO Marc Zuckerberg and his wife say they are donating $300 million to voter integrity projects, the money going to nonprofit groups working to support voters ahead of the November elections.
We knew tech had come down on the side of Joe Biden, but this really makes it very, very clear that these tech moguls really want to use their hundreds of billions of dollars, in some cases trillions of dollars, to really sway elections. I think the American people are not going to like this. I think having these incredibly rich people take over our elections and influence the outcomes in this way is really abhorrent.
We will expand our partnerships with election commissions around the world. We already work with electoral commissions in many countries to help people register to vote and to learn about the issues. And we're going to keep doing that. And now we're also going to establish a channel to inform election commissions of the online risks that we've identified in their specific elections.
The election was bought way before Election Day. And that, I think, is the staggering bombshell.
If we had had a traditional election where people voted on Election Day, as they've had throughout American history, there's very little doubt in my mind that Donald Trump would be president today. As my good friend John Funn would say, they stole it fair and square. They changed the voting rules in the middle of the game. Why is Zuckerberg, and why are these people like Bloomberg and others giving hundreds of millions of dollars to promote a left-wing, anti-free market capitalism agenda? It doesn't make any sense.
I wish I could tell you that we're going to be able to stop all interference, but that just wouldn't be realistic. There will always be bad actors in the world, and we can't prevent all governments from all interference. But we can make it harder. We can make it much harder. And that's what we're going to focus on doing.
Our elections cannot be left up to billionaires like Marc Zuckerberg, especially when groups like Facebook systematically silence conservative voices on their platforms. Across the country, Zuckerberg alone injected over $400 million into specifically chosen counties in an attempt to impact how elections were run on the local level. Right here in Mississippi, we even saw multiple indictments as a product of corruption that stemmed from his funding.
And maybe this is one of the most important things we've done. We banned Zuckerbucks in Florida. And so Zuckerberg from Facebook, he did $420 million into these nonprofit groups. And the nonprofits would go into key areas in terms of the election, and they would basically commandeer the elections office. They would give millions of dollars. They'd bring in their people. They would do big ballot harvesting and mail ballot operations. And that's wrong to have a private tech mogul basically commandeer the actual machinery of the elections. And so he's said now he's not going to do this in 2022 because he's getting a lot of scrutiny on it. But from Florida's perspective, it doesn't matter what he wants to do. He is not allowed to do that in Florida, and there's not going to be any Zuckerbucks.
The biggest issue in many people's minds about Zuckerbucks is what is a private citizen doing providing money to what is a public service, the fundamental right of our Constitution, the fundamental right of citizens in this country, which is the right to vote. But it goes deeper than that. Who wants to take a shot at what Zuckerbucks actually did?
Well, I will. There's a little bit of background to this. The background is the result of the 2016 election. Because the media skews to the left, the Trump campaign very ingeniously was able to use social media to get its message out, advertising and so on. So when the result of the 2016 election, kind of an upset, Trump beats Hillary, there was apparently a Facebook gathering at which Facebook staffers were weeping, gnashing of teeth. It was almost biblical. I mean, they were basically saying, we are responsible for this monster Trump being elected. We cannot allow this to happen again. And I think what happened with Marc Zuckerberg is he kind of got the message, and he figured out that not only should the social media platforms do censorship, which is a problem in itself, but then something unprecedented and so outrageous, I think no one even thought to make it illegal, which is you put in a giant amount of money, something close to $500 million. You infiltrate election offices with your activists. They start commandeering the way elections are run, and then you start funding these privately funded mail-in drop boxes.
You also had John Podesta, who met with Mark Zuckerberg and had him hire David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign manager. David Plouffe published a book in about March of 2020 called The Citizen's Guide to Defeating Donald Trump. In that book, he said, and everybody knows this, you know when you study the elections, presidential specifically, it's going to come down to about 15 counties. And David Plouffe wrote that it's going to come down to a block-by-block street fight in Philadelphia, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Detroit, and Atlanta. And guess where Zuckerberg money started to flow? Right then. Now, this involves dozens of nonprofits that have been formed clear back into 2016, Dinesh, as they started to implement this plan. And then they had the COVID hit, and so they were able to shut down in-person polling places and then elevate mail-in balloting. And how do Republicans prefer to vote? In person. It became harder to vote in person, and in certain areas with the Zucker boxes or drop boxes. I'll give you one example. Delaware County, Pennsylvania, Democrat stronghold. One drop box every 4 square miles, plus ballot harvesters paid by Zuckerberg. In the 59 counties that Trump won, one drop box every 1,159 square miles.
This was part of their get out the vote effort and an effort I'm happy to say that a lot of states have banned. Not just Florida and not just the traditional Republican states, but I think, the pastor made a good point, earlier. We have to stop looking at this as just an issue because of 2020. This is a problem for 2022, 2024, 2028. It doesn't matter who's up, who's down, who's running, who's not. If we don't clean these things up, if we don't do the basic steps at the America First Policy Institute where I work, we have 4 simple steps and a simple slogan: make it easy to vote, impossible to cheat. It's that. That's not partisan. That should be universally praised. It's a great goal to have, and it requires photo ID. It requires ballot harvesting bans and Zucker bucks, bans on Zucker bucks, and just very elementary things that if we can do that, we can start to restore confidence. It's not just 2020, as we talked about earlier in that first segment. This has been going on for decades.
That's not partisan, but unfortunately, I think what happened in 2020 is the Zuckerbucks, what should have been nonprofit and nonpartisan, became decidedly partisan. They laundered money through election offices in essentially what became get-out-the-vote operations for reliable Democratic voters. That's right. I think it was your report that pointed out what Milwaukee did, and they put it in there, hey, we'll take your money and we will get an RV, we will do radio ads in Spanish. We will target specifically people who always vote Democrat. In Atlanta, and Dinesh, I think you know this as well as anybody, you talk about where the drop boxes were located. We did an analysis in the primary in 2016. Before we knew who was going to be on the ballot, they put 17 drop boxes in place. 16 of those 17 drop boxes in Fulton County went to areas that Biden won. So they said, okay, we're going to have more people show up. They did another 20 drop boxes. 33 of the 37 drop boxes they did with Zuckerberg money went in reliable Biden areas. So unfortunately, the thumb's on the scale, and that's what causes, I think, people to question, well, wait, why did we do this? Are we doing this in the name of democratic voter outreach, or are we doing this in the name of global health?
Yes,
Bernard, go ahead.
I was going to respond. If I may speak to the layperson who's watching this.
Sure.
Politics is power. Who has it? How did they get it? How are they using it? Who's benefiting most from it? Should they keep it? And that should be dictated by the vote, but it's not. So it's not surprising to me that private interests would do everything they can to influence election outcomes. The question is, how do we respond to that?
Well, one thing, let me ask this question, because that's where you come in here. Because I'm reminded, I've cited it on this program before, of Benjamin Franklin's words upon exiting the Constitutional Convention when asked, what have you given us? And he said, a republic, if you can keep it. That's where you come in. Because if people aren't being honest, none of this is going to work.
Well, look, Jonathan Sachs points to, in his work on morality, the 3 systems that are in place throughout history in every society. The political system, which influences by force, government, policy, legislation, the economic system, which influences by incentive and deterrence, and the moral system. That's where I come in, where we influence by a set of higher values, virtues, responsibilities, and constraints. It is my hope that we, in my context, will do everything we can to cry loud as to the morality of the vote and the importance that we forget about, I will tell you, party politics, race, religion, ethnicity. Let's talk about values, and let's put value system on the table, and let's talk about your value system. And regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, does it begin with something foundational, and that is the life and dignity of the human person and the common good? That's where I come in, yes.
Well, that's one half of America sees one source of media, the other half sees another, and never the twain shall meet. I've often said that what's lacking now is the center, the center on which the planets orbit. The center is gone, and so all the planets are just spinning out into distant outer space. There's no commonality whatsoever.
Absolutely. I was in Nashville, Tennessee, and we had a Building Bridges town hall meeting. And we had individuals, different ideas and perspectives who came together to talk about this divide, this polarization that's in our nation. And it was a model of civil discourse. It was a model of conversation with, perspectives that are at odds with each other, but finding common ground. I think we need to do more of that. And you point to me because, yeah, this is a time where we need trusted voices. And usually the trusted voices are the moral voices in our society, and the clergy.
Don't you find you have to fight for common ground? You have to be intentional to find common ground.
Oh, absolutely.
And I don't think politically we are intentional.
Yeah. You're talking to someone, you're talking to a Republican who's in New York.
Yeah, so you've had to live on common ground.
So you understand, in order for me to function and affect change, I've got to find common ground.
We've lost the radical American middle, which is the recognition of the intrinsic value of every human being, which was gifted to a flawed people at our founding. You know, we have failed to do that throughout our nation's history, but that truth still holds. And we have lost that truth, that promise that our government will have just laws to protect the value of every human life. And cancel culture is not new. You know, our Savior faced it, right? And our Savior was one who would leave the 99 to find the one. That found expression in our nation's founding. And we're still struggling to understand the fullness of it. But right now, it's at war with many of the powers that Dinesh has referenced that want to silence and cancel human beings.
And that's basic, I'm sorry, and that's basic social Christian ethic. In the previous segment, you talked about America being a Christian nation. That is true, not constitutionally, but definitely culturally and ceremonially. Our founding fathers were brilliant in making sure that there was not the establishment of a state religion after 70 years of bloodshed in Europe. But culturally, we're talking about a set of beliefs that are foundational to how we function, a set of values, traditions and practices and institutions that perpetuate those beliefs and practices. Those things are in jeopardy.
Well, not to say ironically, in pursuit of moral values, we've gotten away from them because we instead moralize. And just to talk about election integrity, like, it's one thing to say, hey, I think that voter rolls should be accurate, but in this tension between election security and access for people that maybe historically have been disenfranchised, any step forward towards election integrity can be moralized, and the person can be attacked and called a racist, or you're attempting to suppress the vote. And that's what I think, unfortunately, silences people that want to raise what should be, I mean, to Marc's point, everyone that's legal and a citizen here should be allowed to vote, but to fight to make sure that only legal citizens vote, you run into character attacks, personal attacks, and I think that's what's unfortunate.
We do see such double standards. You know, I mean, obviously, when I came down here today from Washington, D.C., I had to show my ID to board the plane. I had to show my ID to get the hotel room. I don't think the airline and the hotel are racist for making me show my ID. Why shouldn't you have to show an ID to vote, or to cast your ballot, or to get your absentee ballot, or at least to prove you are who you are? Such basic things, but we've allowed it to become demagogued, and without getting too far down the history lesson, I think what we've done is we've gerrymandered ourselves into extremism, and not just in political districts, how we typically use the word gerrymandering. That is true.
Yeah.
We're now media gerrymandering, where I only listen to the media that I believe. Yeah. And then I'm going to be in that echo chamber, and politicians are now choosing their voters rather than the other way around.
Which leads to the question, was Twitter around when Jesus was preaching? When we come back, there are things that can be done, as we've begun to discuss, to make voting more safe, and what you can do to help. That's what we'll focus on when we come back.
Introducing Vinia, a new miracle superfood that has emerged from the Holy Land that is clinically proven to increase your blood circulation. For an investment of about $1 a day, enjoy the health benefits of 1 bottle of red wine in each capsule of Vinia, minus the alcohol, sugar, and calories, and echo the age-old wisdom to take a little wine for your health's sake. A clinical trial showed that Vinia significantly increased dilation of arteries for each person who took 1 capsule of Vinia daily for 3 months. Vinia significantly increases your blood flow and the delivery of oxygen and nutrients to your brain, heart, and other tissues, providing you with improved heart health, physical energy, and mental alertness. So order your Vinia today at ViniaBloodFlow.com or call 800-600-3619. That's ViniaBloodFlow.com or call 800-600-3619. Vinia, better blood flow, better life.
And welcome back. We are just, as you know, the weeks away from Election Day. If we have you stirred at all to get involved, these guests might have some suggestions for you. Let's just go around the table. Marc, start with you.
Well, first off, contact your local political party of choice, whichever one that is. They are looking for volunteers to staff election polls. You could also go to the official side and volunteer through an official office. That's the heart of our elections, is a volunteer spirit that on both sides of the aisle that keeps an eye on it to make sure that those basic integrity protections that we have, there aren't many, that they're at least there being enforced.
But you go beyond that. You want to see IDs involved. IDs are basically free. You don't have to pay for one.
Almost every state that I know of that has passed photo ID requirements does make them available for free for folks who either don't have a need to drive any longer or, but again, we also make sure that protection, I know some states have actually said, well, just bring a utility bill and you're good. I don't think that's going to work to get on the airplane or to open a bank account. No, show a photo ID, a state photo ID.
Dinesh, I know you'd like to see a lot fewer drop boxes.
Well, drop boxes, yes, but I think, some people say we want to go back to an election day, one day, everybody shows up, they vote in person. But let's remember that these election laws are made at the state level. And so you're going to have a different set of laws all over the place. And some places are going to have drop boxes. Now, the election laws, the election rules stipulate that all drop boxes should have 24-hour surveillance. And that was not done in 2020. In fact, in the investigation for 2,000 mules, whole states did no surveillance at all. No surveillance in the state of Wisconsin. Virtually none in Michigan. Maricopa County turned off its surveillance videos. They had them, but they just didn't use them. Very little surveillance in Fulton County. One of the critiques of our film is show me the same mule or professional operative depositing illegal ballots in multiple drop boxes. And the point is, if you have video everywhere, you'd be able to show it. But if the video is so scarce that out of 10 drop boxes, you only have video on 1, then you can only show it that one time. So I would say, as a simple rule of thumb, we need to have eyes on all the drop boxes.
Phil, one of the problems I see is it recurs every 4 years or every 2 years, is we all have jobs. We show up every day, and you get into a pattern of learning how to do your job. Elections are run every 2 years. You don't have the repetition to get good at it, so we see these recurring problems every 2 years or every 4 years. That's certainly one of the problems.
Well, I think that to help remedy those problems, you have to have transparency in elections and inclusiveness. That's critical, which means, and you have to understand, in that room where the ballots are being handled, oftentimes election officials are casting ballots for people who aren't there. So it's the ballot's on the wrong paper, so it can't go through the machine. They will cast that ballot for that person interpreting their intent. Certainly, You want both political parties, as the law requires, to be able to say, look, we did it responsibly. We agree we reflected voter intent. So transparency, we've lost that in America. America was kicked out of the counting room and billionaires invited in. We must not allow private money to dictate how elections are managed. Those two things, transparency and inclusiveness, along with accountability and eliminating private money so government is the umpire and not somebody out there playing the game. Yeah. They need to be neutral, need to be the umpire.
Pastor?
I'll simply say your vote is your voice. If you give up your vote, you're giving up your voice. Plain and simple.
And I would say, use only one voice. It's amazing how many people actually, because they don't actively curate their own presence, can help lead to some of the problems we have with voter rolls. There's nearly 3 million people in this country that are registered to vote in more than one state. And part of the reason why is people will move and they don't notify the state they've left. And some people that are more conservative, I'd ask them, well, how come you haven't notified the other state that you've left? And they say, well, it's none of their business. But what happens, though, is that's one of the reasons why we have the voter roll bloat that we have. In the investigation I did for my book, we found that actually 2,100 people in the state of Florida alone voted in Florida and then voted in a second state. Now, remember that in this century, in 2000, we saw an election that was decided by 530 votes. So when you have that type of administrative error or voter roll bloat, that's what creates the environment in which bad actors can conduct election fraud. And I think that's maybe one of the largest threats to our country's elections.
People need to know that there are real penalties for this. This is the foundation of democracy. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Governor DeSantis has imposed some pretty harsh penalties now.
And some people would think that that's an overreaction, but I think it's important to remember how easily these voter roll errors can be exploited. The city of New York did an undercover investigation a few years ago. They identified 63 erroneous voter registrations, and they sent undercover agents to try to vote on behalf of those people. Of the 63 attempts, 61 were successful. And one of the only 2 attempts that wasn't successful, somebody was attempting to cast a ballot on behalf of a felon. The felon's mother was actually working at the election place, and that's why it didn't work. So the election errors are real, and they're easily exploited.
And I would say, too, one lesson from 2020 that we should carry forward, we're seeing it happening right now in the state of Pennsylvania, is I think if we're going to have candidate debates, they need to be before early voting starts. You should not be voting before you at least seen these 2 or 3 or whatever candidates standing on stage together, whether it's at the presidential level or for the U.S. Senate or in any race. You know, too many of these, I think it's just, well, we've always done them at this time, but laws have changed, time to update.
You know what? Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to make a point that may seem partisan, but it really isn't, and that is that psychologically the two parties approach elections a little differently. Republicans approach elections as if they focus on the campaign, which is to say, let's get the message out, let's present our ideas. Democrats historically are much more, I would say, crafty, clever, effective at focusing on the mechanics of the election, things that Phil was talking about. Things like, where are those drop boxes going to be located? Are they going to be spread randomly or more over here and fewer over there? Who's going to take the ballots out of the drop box and fill out the custody documents? Who's going to transport the ballots? Who's going to open the envelope? If somebody has a smudged vote, who gets to decide what that vote really goes to? So I think what you need in order to have parity at the polls is for Republicans to realize it is just as important to be involved in the process of elections as it is to be involved in the campaign.
Said the Democrats play this game so much better than Republicans do.
Well, look at what happened with ballot harvesting. California became the first state to legalize it in 2016. They saw a profound benefit politically. So what happened? Republicans said, fine, we'll play that game as well. And so they started conducting it in their own manner, and what I think you saw more equitable political outcomes. But you're exactly right.
Right after Bush v. Gore, the Democrats started organizing efforts to manage elections. They created the Secretary of State Project to elect Democrat secretaries of state. They created nonprofits to advise election offices on how to manage the election. And they are you're absolutely right, Dinesh, very, very involved in that process. And we have to get ourselves in there as well.
You know, the other thing that's I think, unique to both 2016 and 2020 was Donald Trump himself. What an outlier. What an outlier the man was. And he inspired, I think, in many respects, the great divisions that we have. I mean, they preceded Donald Trump, obviously, but this was a new game entirely.
He voiced a new voice. that had not been heard.
Well, I respect the fact that he was the great, destroyer of Washington, in the sense that he illustrated it, and in fact he created some new vocabulary terms about Washington and the swamp.
Do you know how many laws we had when this nation was founded? Its Constitution was written and passed in 1789. 58 federal crimes. You know how many crimes we have today?
Tens of thousands, no doubt.
You can't count them. Yeah. The Congressional Research Service came back and said we can't count them. Many of them will put people in prison for doing a moral good when they did not even know they violated the law.
And I would maintain it's the Democrats, the party of big government, which have learned to exploit these multiple laws.
I think it's less about Donald Trump and more about what he exposed about our nation.
Yeah.
That's what we need to focus on.
What do you think he exposed about our nation?
That we're not as tight as we present ourselves to be, that we have systems and structures in place that have run their course and need to be addressed. It changed the relationship between the public and government. And it always happens whenever there are systems and structures that fail or seem to fail the people. The relationship between people and government changes, and that's exactly what happened.
How about what the founders crafted as the quote-unquote laboratory of the states? It was meant to be yet another check and balance. You can actually examine how the states function and which one has made the right decision, which one made the wrong decision. We saw that certainly with COVID and the various protocol that state governors erected across the land. But when it comes to elections, which are different for every state, is it a help or a hindrance that we have this laboratory of the states and 50 different set of election rules?
I think it's a help, because I mean you have 50 different states that are different geographically, they're different economically, and you do have some states that are very far out there in terms of how they're conducting elections and doing it rather well. Mm-hmm. You have others that are still, probably live, we're with a stone tablet and a rock, at least probably in the back room somewhere.
But, yes, and one of the reasons for that is we wanted to separate power. And that's vitally important. That's why we have 3 branches of government, which, by the way, we're losing under all of the emergencies that are being declared. We lost it in COVID. We had kings and queens of states who assumed all of the legislative, judicial, and executive power. And it ended up in the largest shift of wealth from small business to big tech in U.S. history.
And we are only a couple of votes away from losing that freedom if the federal government is really just the Senate
That's right.
away.
Well, the Constitution specifies that election law changes are the purview of the local legislature, the state legislatures. That all went by the wayside.
There's a big case coming up before the court that will sort of look at... I think what's happening is our institutions are moving really slowly. The Supreme Court, I think, made a mistake in refusing to adjudicate the 2020 election at all. It's almost like Pilate, they washed their hands off of it. I don't think you'd have had January 6th had competent authorities jumped in and said, but it wasn't that they just refused to sort of tackle the issue. They refused to look at it substantively. They're looking at it now. And so, to some degree, a lot of what happened in 2020, and 2020 is important, I think, for the main reason that if you don't fix 2020, you then have the same problems recur. It's kind of like with the Tour de France. If Lance Armstrong cheated, the reason you got to take away his medals is you got to show that there's a penalty for cheating, and then you got to fix the system going forward. So I think Trump seems a little obsessive with 2020, but I think he's right that the way to move forward is to have a full reckoning of what happened the last time around.
We are on the Trinity Broadcasting Network right here. We always like to end on a pastoral note, so let's hear it from the Republican from New York.
Wow. I will say, don't give up on the system. America started out and continues to be the most incredible experiment in a democratic republic in the history of the world. And it's the juice is worth the squeeze. I'll put it that way.
Well, I hope a lot of voters across this country and voters across the world have a chance to hear this panel, because we end on a positive note. And thank you all for coming to Dallas for this. Really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for our special report on election integrity. We hope that you have some takeaways from tonight. One, that voting definitely matters. It matters a great deal. The voters who watch TBN will help ensure that this channel is always on the air. Second, if you want to try to help keep the vote truthful, get involved through your local or state election office. Now is the time. From all of us here at Centerpoint, I'm Doug McKelway. Have a great night.